What does it mean when the last known images of a missing person raise more questions than they answer? That is the question that has haunted investigators, internet sleuths, mental health professionals, journalists, filmmakers, and ordinary people around the world ever since the Los Angeles Police Department released a 4-minute surveillance video in February 2013. The footage showed a 21-year-old Canadian student named Elisa Lam behaving in ways that were deeply strange, pressing elevator buttons erratically, peering into hallways with visible fear, moving her hands and arms in fluid, inexplicable gestures, and then stepping out of an elevator that closed without her and seemingly vanishing into thin air. Within days, the video had been viewed tens of millions of times. It sparked one of the most intense, widespread amateur investigations in the history of the internet. And yet, for all the attention, all the theorizing, all the forensic analysis of pixels and timestamps, the official answer to what happened to Elisa Lam has never fully satisfied the millions of people who watched that footage and felt, with a certainty they could not quite articulate, that something deeply and terribly wrong had taken place. This is the full story of Elisa Lam, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a human being whose life mattered, whose death was a tragedy, and whose case holds up a mirror to the world she lived in and the society that failed to protect her. Part 1. A young woman with a wandering soul. Vancouver, books, and a life shared online. Elisa Lam was born on April 30th, 1991, in Hong Kong. Her parents had emigrated from mainland China, and the family eventually settled in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, one of the most diverse and culturally rich cities in North America. Elisa grew up there, became Canadian in every meaningful cultural sense, and by the time she entered university, she had developed into a young woman of considerable intellectual and creative depth. She was enrolled at the University of British Columbia, where she was studying sociology. To those who knew her, she was thoughtful, curious, and somewhat introverted, the kind of person who processed the world deeply and expressed herself most freely through writing and photography. She was a reader in the most devoted sense of the word. Her bookshelves, visible in photographs she shared online, held volumes by Haruki Murakami, John Green, and other writers who explore the interior lives of young people navigating a confusing and often indifferent world. Elisa maintained an active Tumblr blog under the name I Am 3 Kim, and it was here that she gave her most complete self-portrait to the world. The blog was a collage of everything she loved and wondered about. Photographs she had taken, books she was reading, places she wanted to visit, reflections on the texture of everyday life, and, occasionally, more vulnerable posts that touched on her inner struggles. She wrote with honesty and self-awareness, and her words attracted a modest but devoted following of people who found in her voice something genuine and deeply relatable. What made Elisa Lam's Tumblr especially poignant in retrospect was its intimacy. She shared more on that platform than most people share, even in close conversation. She wrote about feeling lonely, about the complicated business of being young and uncertain about the future, about the joy of losing herself in a good book or a beautiful city. She wrote about music, about fashion, about the strange emotional weight that certain songs can carry. She wrote about her mental health, not with shame or secrecy, but with the kind of candor that speaks to someone who has made peace, at least partially, with a difficult reality. Reading her posts today, with the knowledge of what happened to her, is an almost unbearable experience. She was so clearly alive, so fully present in her thoughts, her observations, her small enthusiasms, and larger anxieties. The gap between the person those posts reveal and the tragedy that followed is one of the things that makes her case so hard to put down. Living with bipolar disorder. Elisa had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a condition characterized by extreme mood episodes that alternate between depressive lows and manic or hypomanic highs. Bipolar disorder affects millions of people worldwide and is one of the more complex and serious mental health conditions, one that requires careful, often lifelong management through medication, therapy, and deliberate lifestyle choices. It is a condition that does not define a person, but that shapes the landscape of their daily life in significant and sometimes unpredictable ways. Elisa was managing her condition with a combination of medications that reflected the multifaceted nature of bipolar disorder treatment. She was taking Wellbutrin, an antidepressant used to treat the depressive phases of the disorder. She was taking Lamictal, a mood stabilizer that is widely used in bipolar treatment to prevent or reduce the severity of both manic and depressive episodes. She was taking Seroquel, an atypical antipsychotic that is commonly prescribed for bipolar disorder to manage acute manic episodes and to stabilize mood over time. And she was taking Effexor, another antidepressant. This combination of medications is not unusual for someone with a moderately severe case of bipolar disorder. Managing the condition often requires a cocktail of drugs that work in different ways and at different timescales, and finding the right combination, the right doses, the right timing, is frequently a long and iterative process. What is known from the toxicological analysis conducted after her death is that the levels of some of these medications in Elisa's bloodstream at the time of her death were not within the expected therapeutic range. Whether that was the result of missed doses, altered metabolism, the disruption of travel, or some other factor is impossible to say with certainty. Elisa was, by the evidence available, doing her best to live well with her condition. She was in university, she was traveling, she was writing and engaging with the world with energy and curiosity. Bipolar disorder did not define her, but it was a thread in the larger tapestry of who she was, and it would become, tragically, one of the most discussed elements of her case after her death, sometimes with sensitivity and insight, and sometimes in ways that reduced her entire complex personhood to a psychiatric diagnosis. Planning the West Coast adventure. In January 2013, Elisa made plans for a solo trip along the West Coast of the United States. This was not an unusual ambition for her. She loved travel, and solo travel in particular appealed to her independent spirit. She had traveled before, and she approached this trip with evident enthusiasm and careful planning. Her itinerary included stops in San Diego, Los Angeles, and eventually Santa Cruz, following the coastal geography of California northward. She arrived in San Diego first, where by all accounts, she had a genuinely good time. She sent messages home to her family, posted on social media, took photographs, and explored the city with the open curiosity that characterized her approach to new places. From San Diego, she made her way north to Los Angeles. She arrived on January 26, 2013. Part 3. The last days of Elisa Lam arrival and the first days. Elisa checked into the Stay on Main section of the Cecil Hotel on January 26, 2013, and was assigned a shared room with other guests, standard practice for a budget hostel. Her first few days at the hotel appear to have been reasonably uneventful. She communicated with her family, explored the city, and appeared to be continuing her trip in the spirit with which she had begun it. However, at some point during her stay, the exact timing is not clearly established in the public record. Hotel management received complaint from the other guests sharing Elisa's room. The nature of those complaints has never been fully disclosed, but they related to her behavior, which her roommates had apparently found concerning or disruptive. In response, hotel management moved Elisa to a private room. This decision, in retrospect, raises troubling questions. If hotel staff were aware that a young solo traveler had been behaving in ways that concerned her fellow guests, ways concerning enough to prompt a formal complaint, what obligation did the hotel have to assess her welfare more thoroughly? Was a welfare check conducted? Was anyone from the hotel's staff assigned to keep an eye on her? Was any consideration given to contacting emergency services or notifying her family? The public record does not provide clear answers to these questions. What is known is that after being moved to a private room, Elisa continued to deteriorate in ways that no one at the hotel appears to have fully noticed or responded to. The elevator video, January 31st, 2013. January 31st, 2013, was the last night Elisa Lam was seen alive. The surveillance footage recorded that evening would become one of the most analyzed and most discussed pieces of video in the history of true crime. A short, grainy, silent film that compresses an enormous amount of mystery into approximately 4 minutes. The footage shows the interior of one of the Cecil Hotel's elevators, captured from a camera positioned near the top of the elevator car. Elisa enters the elevator and immediately begins pressing buttons, many buttons in rapid succession, seemingly without a clear destination in mind. This is the first unusual behavior. She presses buttons for multiple floors simultaneously, which is not consistent with the behavior of someone who knows where they want to go. The elevator does not move. Its doors remain open. She then steps partially out of the elevator and looks to the left, down the hallway, with an expression that, even through the low-resolution footage, conveys something between anxiety and fear. She steps back inside. The doors remain open. She presses more buttons. She steps partially out again, peers down the hallway in both directions, then returns to the elevator interior. Her body language throughout this sequence is that of someone who believes they are being followed or watched, who is checking whether a pursuer is near. She exits the elevator entirely, moves into the hallway, and then engages in the behavior that has generated the most discussion and the most divergent interpretations. She raises her hands and begins moving them in a way that has no clear rational explanation to an outside observer. The movements are fluid, almost graceful, but deeply strange. They look involuntary or ritualistic, or like some kind of communication directed towards something that is not visible in the frame. Different viewers have interpreted these movements through radically different lenses. Some see psychiatric symptomology. Some see the movements of a person who has been drugged. Some see something they can only describe in supernatural terms. She walks away down the hallway, out of the camera's view. The elevator doors, after an unusually long delay, finally close. She does not return to the elevator. She does not appear on any other camera in the hotel. Not the stairwell cameras, not the lobby cameras, not the exterior cameras. She simply vanishes from the recorded world. The disappearance is reported. Elisa's parents, who had been in regular communication with her throughout her trip, became alarmed when contact suddenly stopped after January 31st. They reported her missing to the Los Angeles Police Department on February 1st, 2013, the day after her last appearance on camera. They were, by all accounts, immediately deeply worried. Elisa had been a reliable communicator throughout the trip, and the sudden silence was entirely out of character. The LAPD launched a missing persons investigation and assigned officers to work with the hotel. Searches of the Cecil Hotel's interior, hallways, stairwells, rooftop, basement, common areas, turned up nothing. Physical searches of the surrounding neighborhood also produced no leads. For 2 weeks, the investigation proceeded without any significant development. Elisa Lam had vanished as completely and as mysteriously as if she had never been there. Part 4. The video goes viral, and the investigation takes a new turn. The decision to release the footage. After 2 weeks without meaningful leads, the LAPD made the decision to release the elevator surveillance footage to the public. The reasoning was standard missing persons procedure. If someone in the public, a witness, a hotel guest, a passerby, recognized Elisa or had information about her movements after the footage was captured, releasing the video might generate that tip. The footage was released on February 14th, 2013, with identifying portions of other individuals blurred to protect their privacy. What followed was not the modest public response that investigators might have hoped for. It was a global explosion. Within hours of the footage being posted online, it had been shared across every major social media platform. By the following morning, major news outlets in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Asia had picked up the story. YouTube copies accumulated tens of millions of views within weeks. On Reddit, a dedicated community of amateur investigators assembled with extraordinary speed, creating dedicated threads in which the footage was analyzed frame by frame, second by second. The global internet had become, suddenly and spontaneously, a vast distributed forensics lab focused on a 4-minute clip of a missing girl in an elevator. Why the footage was so disturbing? The viral spread of the footage was not simply a function of its relevance to a missing persons case. It It was a function of the footage's intrinsic quality, the way it made viewers feel. The elevator video triggers something deep and uncomfortable in the human nervous system. Viewers who have no personal connection to the case and no particular interest in true crime report feeling profoundly unsettled after watching it. The experience is compared repeatedly to watching a horror film, but worse because it is real. The reasons for this response are not difficult to identify. The grainy, black and white surveillance aesthetic creates an atmosphere of surveillance and exposure. The confined space of the elevator amplifies the sense of entrapment. Elisa's behavior, the fearful checking of the hallway, the hiding, the strange hand movements, communicates distress in a frequency that bypasses intellectual analysis and registers directly in the emotional brain. Something is wrong. Something is very wrong. The footage communicates this even before the viewer knows who Elisa Lam is or what happened to her. And then there's the final moment, the walking away, the closing doors, the absence that feels in the context of knowing she was never seen alive again, like a vanishing act. Like a magic trick in which the magician does not come back. The theories that proliferated. The internet's response to the footage was not a single, unified theory. It was an explosion of competing, contradictory, and sometimes mutually exclusive narratives, a babble of explanations generated by millions of people who had watched the same 4 minutes and arrived at entirely different conclusions. The most widely discussed theories can be organized into a few broad categories. The criminal theory held that Elisa had been murdered, that someone had been in that hallway with her, that she had been cornered or followed, and that the perpetrator had been edited out of the footage. Proponents of this theory pointed to the edited timestamp, the LAPD's standard redaction of portions of the footage, and the absence of other camera footage covering the area outside the elevator as evidence of a cover-up or at least a gap in the evidentiary record. The supernatural theory held that the footage was evidence of a paranormal encounter, that Elisa's hand movements were signs of demonic possession or interaction with a ghost, that the Cecil Hotel's history had somehow culminated in something beyond rational explanation. This theory found particular traction among viewers who approached the footage through the lens of horror film conventions, and it was amplified by the discovery that the footage bore an uncanny resemblance to plot elements in Dark Water, a Japanese horror film in which a body is found in a building's water tank. The drug theory held that Elisa had been secretly dosed with a hallucinogenic substance, either by a hotel employee or by another guest, and that her behavior in the elevator was the result of a drug-induced psychosis rather than a psychiatric episode. This theory was fueled in part by the erratic and unpredictable nature of her behavior, which some viewers felt was more consistent with acute drug intoxication than with a bipolar episode. And then there was what might be called the coincidence theory, the idea that a chain of coincidences too strange to be coincidental pointed to some larger, hidden pattern. The most widely cited of these coincidences was the existence of a tuberculosis test kit sold under the brand name Elisa, an acronym for a standard immunological testing method that happened to contain both her last name and her first name. At the time of her disappearance, a tuberculosis outbreak was being reported in the Skid Row area directly surrounding the Cecil Hotel, and the Elisa test was being used in diagnosing cases. The coincidence was so striking that many online observers refused to accept it as mere coincidence, constructing elaborate theories around it that never led anywhere. The harassment of an innocent person, perhaps the most damaging and consequential episode in the internet's investigation of the Elisa Lam case, was the targeting of a musician who had been staying at the Cecil Hotel at the time of her disappearance. This individual performed under a horror-themed stage name and made music with dark, disturbing aesthetic elements. When internet investigators discovered his presence at the hotel, they swiftly and wrongly identified him as a person of interest in Elisa's disappearance and death. The logic was thin to the point of non-existence. He was at the hotel, he had a dark artistic persona, and therefore he was suspicious. That is essentially the entirety of the evidence that motivated what followed. A sustained campaign of online harassment was directed at him, his family, and his professional associates. He received death threats. His record label was contacted. His social media accounts were flooded with accusations. His address was shared publicly. People who had no knowledge of his situation or connection to the case participated in the harassment simply because a crowd had determined he was guilty. He was entirely innocent. He had never met Elisa Lam. He had no involvement whatsoever in her disappearance or death. He was a human being who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and who was made to pay an enormous personal and psychological price for it. He has spoken publicly about the severe mental health consequences of the harassment he endured. His case is the clearest possible illustration of the danger of mass amateur investigation conducted without accountability, epistemic humility, or basic human decency. When the internet decided he was guilty, it did not matter that the evidence was non-existent. The crowd had spoken, and the crowd was wrong, and a real person suffered real harm as a result. Part 5. Discovery in the water tank, the complaints that should have been investigated sooner. In the days following Elisa's disappearance, in the weeks during which the LAPD was conducting its investigation and the internet was constructing its theories, guests at the Cecil Hotel had been noticing something wrong with the water. The complaints varied but clustered around consistent themes. The water pressure seemed lower than normal. The water coming from the taps had an unusual color, a brownish or darkened tinge. It tasted strange, with an off smell that guests found unpleasant. Some guests reported these concerns to hotel staff. The complaints were investigated at the property management level, but the investigation did not, for reasons that have never been fully explained, extend to a physical check of the rooftop water tanks. This failure, and it is difficult to describe it as anything other than a failure, would later become one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case. The possibility that a more prompt inspection of the water supply could have led to an earlier discovery, or that the water complaints were a direct indication of what was in the tanks, haunts the narrative. Santiago Lopez and the discovery. On February 19, 2013, a maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez was dispatched to the rooftop of the Cecil Hotel to investigate the ongoing water issues. The rooftop housed 4 large water tanks that supplied the building's water. Lopez climbed to the rooftop, approached the tanks, and opened the lid of one of them. What he found inside was Elisa Lam's body. She was floating in the tank unclothed. Her clothing and a small number of personal belongings were found on the rooftop surface nearby, outside the tank, not inside it with her. She had been in the water for an estimated 2 to 3 weeks. The discovery was immediately devastating in ways that radiated outward from the personal to the institutional. For Elisa's family, who had been living for 3 weeks in a state of desperate uncertainty, it was the worst answer to the worst question. For the guests of the Cecil Hotel, many of whom had been unknowingly using water supplied from the contaminated tank for days, drinking it, cooking with it, bathing in it, it was a revelation of profound horror. Accounts from former guests confirm that some of them had noted the unusual taste and color of the water in the days before the body was discovered, and had simply assumed it was an ordinary plumbing issue. The questions the scene raised. The physical scene on the rooftop, the tanks, the lid, the positioning of Elisa's clothing, immediately generated questions that investigators and observers found difficult to answer. These questions were not necessarily evidence of foul play, but they were genuine puzzles that added to the overall sense of the case's inexplicability. The water tanks were large, industrial-grade containers, approximately 8 feet tall. They were accessed from above. To look into or enter a tank, a person would need to climb to the level of the tank's opening. The lids of the tanks were heavy, designed to be secured against accidental opening or environmental contamination. For Elisa to have entered the tank voluntarily or involuntarily, someone or something would need to have gotten her to the top of the tank and then through the opening. Furthermore, access to the rooftop itself was supposed to be restricted. A door connected the hotel's interior to the rooftop and was reportedly equipped with an alarm designed to notify staff whenever it was opened. Whether the alarm was functioning on the night in question, whether it was triggered, and whether any response was made to it if it was triggered. These questions have never been answered with clarity or satisfaction in the public record. The fact that Elisa's clothing was found outside the tank, near it but not inside it, was noted as significant. If she had entered the tank while clothed and removed her clothing inside the tank, that clothing would presumably be inside the tank as well. The clothing's location outside the tank suggested either that she undressed before entering the tank, or that someone else removed her clothing and placed it there. Neither explanation is straightforwardly simple. Part 6. The official findings and the psychiatric explanation, the coroner's report. The Los Angeles County Department of Medical Examiner coroner conducted a thorough post-mortem examination of Elisa Lam's remains under conditions made difficult by the significant decomposition that had occurred during the 3 weeks she had been in the water. Nevertheless, the examination was extensive, and the coroner's office filed an official report in June 2013. The cause of death was ruled as accidental drowning. The manner of death was classified as accidental. The examination found no evidence of trauma consistent with assault or homicide. No illegal substances were detected in her system. Toxicological analysis did identify the presence of her prescribed psychiatric medications, the Wellbutrin, Lamictal, Seroquel, and Effexor she had been taking for her bipolar disorder, but found that the levels of some of these medications were not within the expected therapeutic range. The report concluded that this discrepancy in medication levels was consistent with altered or disrupted medication management. The report also addressed the psychiatric dimension of the case directly, noting that the behavioral evidence, the elevator footage, was consistent with a severe manic or mixed episode associated with bipolar disorder, potentially exacerbated by the disruption of her medication regimen during travel. The psychiatric explanation in detail. Mental health professionals who reviewed the case in the aftermath of the coroner's report offered detailed, clinically grounded explanations for how bipolar disorder in a severe acute phase could account for both the behavior seen in the elevator footage and the circumstances of Elisa's death. Bipolar disorder, in its most severe manifestations, can produce states of profound psychological disorganization that are entirely unlike the person's ordinary functioning. During a manic or mixed episode, particularly one that has escalated to include psychotic features, a person may experience racing thoughts that they cannot control, paranoid beliefs that feel completely real, hallucinations, visual, auditory, or tactile, grandiose or delusional convictions about their identity or circumstances, and severely impaired judgment that makes ordinary risk assessment impossible. The behavior in the elevator footage maps onto this clinical picture with uncomfortable precision. The repeated pressing of multiple buttons simultaneously, a form of behavioral perseveration consistent with disorganized thinking. The fearful checking of the hallway, consistent with paranoid ideation, the belief that someone is pursuing or watching the individual. The movement into and out of the elevator, hiding and then emerging, consistent with the behavioral expression of paranoid fear. The unusual hand movements, consistent with the stereotyped or ritualistic motor behaviors that can accompany psychotic states. As for how Elisa accessed the rooftop and entered the water tank, mental health professionals have pointed out that a person in a severely manic or psychotic state can exhibit unusual determination and physical capability, driven by an internal logic that has no visible external referent, but that feels, to the person experiencing it, completely compelling. The act of climbing to the roof, navigating to the tanks, opening a lid, and entering the water, while deeply irrational by any ordinary standard, may have constituted, within the distorted experiential reality of her episode, a necessary or even urgent action. She may have been hiding from a perceived pursuer. She may have believed the tank was a place of safety. She may have been following a hallucinatory directive that had no external reality. Once inside a tank of water, the difficulty of escape would have been extreme even for someone in full possession of their faculties. The walls would be smooth and slick with moisture. The opening above would require significant upper body strength to reach and push open. The disorientation of immersion in cold water in a confined, dark space would have been overwhelming. For someone already in a severely psychotic state, the possibility of mounting a successful escape effort would have been vanishingly small. What the official findings did not resolve. The official ruling of accidental death is accepted by most medical and psychiatric professionals who have examined the case, and there are strong clinical reasons to find it persuasive. But it did not, and does not, resolve every question that the case raises. Several specific points have never been satisfactorily addressed in the public record. The rooftop door and its alarm. Was the alarm functioning on the night of January 31st? Was it triggered? If so, was a response made? The hotel's records on this point were never made fully public, and the question remains open. The tank lid. How accessible was it truly? Was it fully secured at the time, or was there some deficiency in its closure that made it easier than it should have been to open? The physical specifications of the tank lids were discussed in the investigation, but no definitive public accounting of their precise condition was provided. The surveillance gaps. Were there cameras in the stairwells near the rooftop access, on the rooftop itself, or in other locations that might have captured Elisa's movements after she left the elevator hallway? If such footage exists, it has never been released to the public. If it does not exist, if those areas truly had no surveillance coverage, that itself speaks to the inadequacy of the hotel's security infrastructure. These unresolved questions do not constitute evidence of homicide. They may reflect nothing more than the institutional failures of a poorly managed hotel, the incomplete nature of any investigation, and the inherent limits of what can be established forensically after 3 weeks in a water tank. But they are the substrate on which conspiracy theories continue to grow, and they will not be silenced until they are addressed with more transparency than has been offered to date. Part 7. The Cultural Aftermath, a Netflix documentary. In 2021, Netflix released a 4-part documentary series titled Crime Scene: The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel, directed by Joe Berlinger. The documentary was the most comprehensive publicly available account of the case to date, drawing on interviews with LAPD investigators, former hotel staff, mental health professionals, true crime podcasters, and, most significantly and unusually, the internet sleuths who had made the Elisa Lam case a global obsession. The documentary did something important and somewhat rare for the true crime genre. It turned its critical eye not only on the mystery, but on the people who had made the mystery a cultural event. It examined, with considerable candor, the way in which the internet's collective investigation of the case had led to the harassment of innocent people, the spread of damaging misinformation, and the reduction of a complex, suffering human being to a puzzle to be solved. It asked, without quite answering, the question of whether the true crime genre, in its internet-native form, driven by anonymous crowds and the incentives of virality, serves justice or serves only itself. The documentary also grappled with the Cecil Hotel's history in a way that situated Elisa's death within the larger context of the building's long relationship with poverty, addiction, violence, and institutional neglect. It made the argument, compellingly, if not entirely explicitly, that the Cecil Hotel was not simply the site of Elisa's death, but a kind of architectural embodiment of everything that can go wrong when society fails its most vulnerable members and when profit motives override basic human obligations. The Internet's long memory. One of the defining features of the Elisa Lam case, a decade on, is the way it has refused to fade. Most missing persons cases, even high-profile ones, follow a predictable arc: intense initial attention, an official resolution, and then a gradual retreat into background noise. The Elisa Lam case did not follow this arc. It remained present in internet culture with unusual persistence, cited, discussed, reanalyzed, and rediscovered by new generations of true crime enthusiasts who encountered the elevator footage for the first time and felt the same profound unease that millions before them had felt. This persistence says something important about the nature of the case. It says that the official resolution, accidental death, has not felt, to large numbers of people, like a true resolution. It says that the elevator footage continues to communicate something that resists explanation, that triggers a response deeper than what the facts, as officially established, seem to warrant. Whether that resistance reflects genuine, unanswered questions, the human brain's discomfort with psychiatric behavior it cannot easily categorize, or some combination of the two, is difficult to say. What is clear is that Elisa Lam's story will be told and retold for years to come, in formats and by people she could never have anticipated. Her case has become part of the cultural vocabulary of the internet era, a shorthand for the intersection of mystery, tragedy, mental illness, institutional failure, and the complex ethics of collective attention. The Tumblr that kept posting. One of the eeriest aspects of the immediate aftermath of Elisa's disappearance was the behavior of her Tumblr blog. After her disappearance on January 31st, and even after her death was confirmed in February, new posts continued to appear on the blog at regular intervals. For observers who had not encountered the queue feature of the Tumblr platform, which allows users to schedule posts in advance, to be published automatically on specified dates, the experience of seeing new content from a woman who was missing and then dead was profoundly disturbing. The explanation, once understood, is entirely mundane. Elisa had queued up posts before she left for her trip, scheduling them to publish in her absence. The blog was doing exactly what she had set it up to do. There was nothing supernatural about it. But the effect of a voice continuing to speak after its owner had been silenced was something that many people found impossible to process emotionally as mere technical functionality. It felt, whatever the explanation, like a haunting. Elisa's family eventually had the Tumblr blog taken down, reclaiming her words and her self-expression from the public domain of a platform that had become a site of morbid fascination. It was an entirely understandable decision. Her blog was her voice, her interior life made visible. It deserved better than to serve as a source of material for true crime analysis. Part 8. The larger questions the case forces us to ask: mental health and the world's failures. The Elisa Lam case cannot be reduced to a single systemic failure. It is the product of multiple failures, stacked and intersecting, each one individually insufficient to cause what happened, but collectively lethal in combination. There was the failure of the hotel, its inadequate security infrastructure, its unclear and apparently ineffective rooftop access protocols, its apparent failure to respond adequately to signs that a guest was in crisis. There was the failure of the broader support system available to a young person with bipolar disorder traveling alone in a foreign country. No system existed to monitor her welfare. No protocol required that someone check in on her. She was an adult, exercising her right to independence and freedom, and the price of that freedom, in the absence of adequate mental health support infrastructure, was paid in full. There was the failure that occurs when psychiatric medications are disrupted by travel, stress, irregular sleep, and changed routines, a failure not of any individual, but of the knowledge gap that exists between what medications are supposed to do and what they actually do in the complex, variable conditions of a real human life. And there was the larger, structural failure of a society that talks frequently about mental health awareness, but has still not built the systems, the institutions, and the everyday practices that would allow a young person with bipolar disorder to travel the world with the same degree of safety as a young person without it. The ethics of true crime. The Elisa Lam case is also, unavoidably, a case about how we consume tragedy. The true crime genre, in its podcast form, its documentary form, its Reddit thread form, its YouTube video form, has become one of the most popular forms of entertainment in the contemporary world. Millions of people listen to detailed accounts of real murders and disappearances while driving to work, doing household chores, exercising. The genre is, in the most basic sense, enormously appealing. The ethical questions this raises are not simple. There is a legitimate argument that true crime content raises public awareness about crime, advances empathy for victims, and serves a genuine journalistic function. There is also a legitimate argument that it converts human suffering into entertainment, reduces victims to narrative functions, exposes families to unwanted scrutiny, and, in its internet-native amateur form, enables the kind of mob behavior that harmed the innocent musician in the Elisa Lam case. These arguments are not mutually exclusive. Both can be true simultaneously, and both deserve to be held in mind by anyone who consumes true crime content. The question is not whether to engage with these stories. They are part of our shared human experience, and engaging with them can be done ethically, but how to engage with them in ways that maintain the full humanity of the people at the center. Elisa Lam was not a puzzle. She was not a mystery. She was a person. She loved books and cities and writing. She struggled with a serious illness and did her best to live fully in spite of it. She deserved to grow old, to finish her degree, to travel more of the world, to write more of the words that clearly wanted to come out of her. She did not get those things. She got a death that became a global fascination, a 4-minute video that has been watched hundreds of millions of times, and a Tumblr blog that kept posting after she was gone. She deserved better. And the best way any of us can honor that fact is to remember her as she was, not as the eerie figure in an elevator, not as a mystery, not as a data point in a theory, but as a young woman whose life had value, whose death was a loss, and whose story, told fully and honestly, has something genuinely important to say about the world we all share. Conclusion: living in the space of unanswered questions. What really happened to Elisa Lam? The official answer is that she drowned accidentally in a water tank on the rooftop of the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles, most likely during a severe psychiatric episode associated with her bipolar disorder, possibly exacerbated by disruption of her medication regimen. The investigation found no evidence of homicide. The psychiatric explanation is medically plausible and supported by clinical expertise. The accidental ruling is almost certainly correct. And yet the case does not feel closed. Not because the evidence demands a different conclusion, but because the questions it raises about institutional responsibility, about the care available to people with mental illness, about the ethics of how we engage with tragedy, are themselves not answered by an official cause of death ruling. Those questions remain open, as they should, because there are questions about the kind of world we want to build and the kind of people we want to be. Elisa Lam deserved a world in which a young woman with bipolar disorder could travel alone safely. She deserved a hotel that would notice when a guest was in crisis. She deserved a support system that would have caught her before she fell through all the cracks that conspired to lead her to a rooftop in downtown Los Angeles on a January night in 2013. She deserved, at minimum, a death that did not become entertainment. She was 21 years old. She had read dozens of Murakami novels and wanted to read dozens more. She had a blog and a camera and a wandering soul and a brilliant, complicated mind that her illness made harder to live with but did not diminish. She had a whole life ahead of her, full of the trips and the books and the words and the cities she had not yet seen. That life was cut short, and the least we can do, the very least, is to remember it fully, to honor the person she was rather than the mystery she became, and to ask, with genuine seriousness, what we might do differently so that the next young woman with a wandering soul and a difficult illness and a love of Murakami novels comes home safely from her trip.